my high school had a bunch of woods behind it. I lived in a rural part of Ohio, so there were cornfields and forest abundantly spread. It was also quite common for the cross-country runners to take their runs through some parts of the woods during practice sessions. I knew this because my ex-girlfriend was part of the cross-country team, and she would take runs through the woods quite frequently. At one point she told me that if you take an hour or two to run through the woods, there was an abandoned playground somewhere right in the middle. It made no sense to be built there. There were no houses nearby, or even any schools. And it was not really in a clearing where the playground was built. It was as if it was just built into the woods. I mean, it seemed like someone just stuck the equipment wherever it fit and converted that confined space into a playground. She also told me stories of how the runners would avoid that area and go around it in a long, wide circle if they got any hints that they were getting close to it. In fact, they would get to know it maybe like from half a mile away itself. And before you wonder as to how the runners would get to know if they were getting closer, let me explain. Because even I had the same doubt. I mean, if the runners saw the playground, they would turn and that would make sense. But how would they know that they were getting closer without actually getting within the viewing range? So my ex-girlfriend claimed that as you got closer to the grounds, you would start to hear footsteps behind you. And this was maybe like half a mile away itself. And that sound of footsteps would get faster as you approached the playground. The closer you got to the ground, it would get faster, and the other way round. So that way, it was possible to change the direction of the run so as to avoid the playground completely. Now, me being a high schooler and dumb, I grabbed my friend and told him that we should go to this place to see what was up. And we did. It took a gigantic amount of time to walk up there. And it really was an hour or so before we got there. But when we got there, we didn't hear any footsteps or any sort of movement around us at all. So we started to think if it was all a rumor started by the runners. Eventually, we got there and now we were literally at the playground. The only equipment there was a 2-swing set and one of those merry-go-round things where bullies strap nerds to in movies and spin them around for fun. Since we had walked all the way there, we were tired. And our excitement of finding something supernatural had ended in disappointment. So we decided to take a load off and hop on the swings for some harmless fun, just for a few minutes. So we got on the swings and went about our business. Everything was cool for about 2 minutes. And at that point, we were swinging at close to the maximum peak of our swing's height. As my friend swings backward and is coming back in his downswoop to go forward at full speed, he had no clue what was going to happen. While in the pendulum motion, he falls ahead and hits the ground, while the swing normally just sits in an idle position. He wasn't pushed ahead, but his swing had just completely halted. It was like the swing was grabbed by someone from behind saying, "All right, time's up." It had just halted mid-motion. So he was on the floor recovering from the sudden shock from the fall, while mine continued to swing. But I saw that and jumped the hell off my swing. My friend and I bolted out of there, shitting our pants. As we ran away, we started to hear those footsteps on either side of us. They were very fast at first and felt like they would catch up with us, but then they diminished once we got far enough away. We never went back. I did not even bring up the topic of that playground again. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. In mid-2018, my girlfriend and I took a 3-week-long road trip and camped in the backwoods or hiked the whole time. Oh, by the way, I am a girl too. So it was just the two of us girls hanging out. We got to one free campsite in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in New Mexico. We were the only people there, and that was not so unusual. So we just took the first spot that we found good enough to set up our camp and started unpacking our stuff. As we made dinner, a couple pulled into the camping grounds, drove past us, and headed to the back of the campgrounds. It was a vast area, so we had no idea as to how far back it went. About 15 to 20 minutes later, they came back and flagged me down. The lady asked me if we had been back there. I just shook my head as a no. The girl's next line shocked me. She said that it was like a massacre back there. I asked her what did she mean by whatever she just said. She claimed that there were bones everywhere. Her face was reeking of anxiety. She asked if they could camp next to us, and we obliged. Now we were more than happy to have neighbors. It just feels safer in a larger group, especially when you're in the middle of nowhere. They stay for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, look around, then get back in their car and leave the campsite. My friend and I wondered as to what was all of that about. Like just a few minutes ago, they wanted to camp next to us. And now they left the site without saying anything. I explained to my friend what the girl had said, and at that moment, we looked down and noticed a huge femur bone under our feet. It was possibly a buffalo. Well, us being a little cryptic enthusiast, we decide to go check out what they were talking about. We get about 150 yards back through the windy camp, and there it was. There were full-blown animal carcasses everywhere. Some were scattered, some still whole, one pile of what looked like fox fur, and another deer body that was still in a trash bag. We had a theory of our own that kinda explained the situation. Our theory is that was where they dumped all the roadkill which they scraped up off the highway. But we didn't figure this out until a couple of days later. Nonetheless, if there were that many bodies lying around there, for whatever reason, then other predatory animals must be aware that they're here too. And we didn't want to be around whenever they come by for dinner. We decided to pack up and find a different camp for the night. So we drive for about an hour or so, still in the middle of nowhere, and haven't seen a single car this entire time. There were no houses, just old country roads and pastures. Mind you, the sun was starting to set. The road turned to dirt for a bit, and we crossed a cattle guard and saw the national park signboard. It was a national park and it was free, so it couldn't be too bad. My friend thought that the signboard looked a little sketchy, but we were ready to relax and get some well-deserved rest after an arduous day spent driving. So I hit the left turn and started up the hill to the national park. Looking at the map, it looked like it was only about 4 miles from the map. We started going up this road and drove around a few curves. We noticed that the brush on the side gradually starts getting thicker and thicker, and the road starts getting rough. Now, to put this in perspective, we're in my fairly new car, and it had a manual transmission. The ground clearance of my car was low, such that it was less than a foot from the ground. About a quarter mile in, and we high center on a huge rock. Okay, as long as that won't get any worse ahead, I thought that we could manage. Also, there was no possible way to turn around or back out anyway, so we decided to keep going. But of course, it got worse than that. Every rock and trench, we heard the car just scrape and stutter and stall. I'm clenching the wheel, and she's clenching the handle. All the bush on the sides of us is now dead and eerie looking, and the sun has almost gone behind us. 40 terrifying minutes later, we finally make it to the top flat of this hill, which was supposed to be a campsite. It is about a 10 square foot clearing in the dead bush, and in front of us, a cliff. We were still freaked out about the dead animals, and now we felt like we were in the plot of some low-budget horror film, literally trapped on top of this hill. It was dark and neither of us even wanted to get out of the car. We decided that we cannot camp there in our right minds. Even from this cliff top, we couldn't see a single house or even a car light. It might be a figment of our imagination, but we could hear some movement around us. And it felt like it was getting closer. We make a 10-point turn between the bush and boulders and the cliff, manage to get back on the path, and very slowly and carefully scrape our car all the way back down that damned hill. We in the car miraculously survived, and we had another 3 hours back to the closest town and slept in the Walmart parking lot. A couple of years ago, my friend and I went to explore a nearby cave. It wasn't an ordinary cave. It was a limestone cave where I had been before too, but never gone very deep inside to explore it. I had heard from other explorers that there was a waterfall inside the cave that eventually leads to an expansive area beyond. So my friend and I set out to try and find the path. Since we've never been on this route, we took turns going forward and checking back so as to avoid passing points of no return without one of us being above with a rope to toss down. After the familiar route was behind us, we found a tight climb down. The squeeze was like going from the front seat to the back seat, that too in a compact sedan that was vertical. Next, we found a tunnel that was wide but short. We took off our packs and dragged them behind our feet while we crawled for maybe 15 to 20 meters. It was getting a little claustrophobic, but we knew what we were getting into. We came to a small opening about the size of a small bathroom. In this little space, we could at least stand up, and so it was a bit of a relief to us. The path forward was a small square tunnel, the same height as the previous route, but maybe 2 to 3 meters wide. We jokingly called it the coffin crawl. This route required us to go one behind the other and led to a 90-degree turn. At the turn, I could see the path continued way past the range of my headlamp, but mostly all seemed level and safe. At this point, slowly it became apparent the path was getting more narrow ever so slightly. If we wanted to turn back, we would have had to crawl backward single file. I could not speculate how far we crawled, but it seemed like an extremely long way until I could see a small opening up ahead, maybe the size of a cramped coat closet, but 2/3 the height. At this point, that space was looking pretty comforting, because it would mean we could at least turn around if we decided to go back. Right before the oncoming closet-sized space was the tightest squeeze I've ever tried in a cave. I had to place one arm ahead and drag the other to get my shoulders to fit diagonally. As my light illuminated the closet space, I could see a single stalagmite in the center and some bats resting on its walls and on the sloped ceiling. Small mouse-eared bats were uncommon, but not a shocking sight. But our voices disturbed them and they decided to exit. And their only exit was past our prone one-by-one bodies. Their fluttering should have been non-threatening, but in combination with the inability to move, it became very unsettling. It took a lot of mental control to avoid panicking from the lack of space, the apparent lack of air, and the bats. After the bats had passed and I had caught my breath and sanity, we entered the small opening. Upon the single stalagmite was a small note, the torn corner of a piece of notebook paper. The note had text written on it in blue pen. It read, "Nothing here." We had not found the path we sought, and instead found nothing. We turned back and finally made it back alive and in one piece. So being a little kid of around 10 to 12 years, I had my own creepy middle of nowhere story. We had these woods around our home. The woods were so vast that I never ever came close to finding the edge of it. I would wake up early in the morning when there was no school, and my friend Mark and I would spend the whole day out, hanging around those woods. We would pack sandwiches and sodas, and just go out exploring. This being the 80s and Mark and I being smart enough kids, my parents had no problem with this, and enjoyed taking us to the Army surplus store to buy stuff like MREs and survival knives, and camping gear. It was pretty regular that we would be allowed to stay out overnight too, if my dad was there to help us set up camp close to the property. So not on an overnight, but out and about one day, we come across a treehouse in a part of the woods where we had never been before. It would have been probably about an hour and a half long trek from the edge of the neighborhood. Maybe 2 miles or 3 miles, and the area was hilly and rocky. This treehouse was probably 25 to 35 feet off the ground, but it looked solid. We were so stoked to find our new castle and climb it to claim it. We hightail it back home to get some rope, and my pops take us down to the surplus store, and over dinner, Mark and I couldn't keep calm about it. The next day comes, and we hike out at almost dawn. We got a backpack full of rope and sandwiches. We had latched our knives on our hips, and we carried our water bottles to last there as long as possible. We make it out there and start attaching rungs made from big sticks onto one end of the rope. It took us a good few hours, but we get one side finished. We tossed the rope over the branch, because that was where the little deck and the door were. We finally climbed up and were sitting on the deck looking at the scenic view from the top. And then we played 3 turns of rock, paper, scissors to decide who gets to go in first. To my disappointment, Mark won it, and he went in and came right out in a second or two. He was white as a sheet and wanted to go home. So curious as I go inside. This treehouse is probably 10 by 10 and about 7 or 8 high inside. The inside of the walls was completely filled with pictures of women from our locality. And not just pictures, but photos were taken in hiding. There were photos of familiar folk in poses and conditions that scarred our little minds. It seemed like some hidden cameras were set up in our homes. And the photos were clicked. Mark and I got back home as quickly as we could. We rushed home and informed my dad about it, and he called the cops. He knew that kids our age would be too naive to make this shit up. The officer shows up and asks us a few questions like where it was, how did we get up there, and where did we buy the rope. He also asked if we did manage to take any pictures off the wall. He got increasingly rude about it, and my dad put an end to the conversation. He left with our statement and said he would be in touch soon. After that, we were no longer allowed to take overnight camps in the woods or be out there for more than an hour without checking in. We were pretty much cut off from the deep exploring of the woods. About a year or two later, that same cop stopped me when I was hanging out in a different park. He saw me smoking and caught me with a joint. Mark asked him what happened with the treehouse. The cop told us to not do drugs and left us alone. Years later in college, Mark sent me an email saying how he read in the big state paper that officer shot himself with his service revolver after his wife found out he was circulating personal pictures of other women. So it comes to my mind as it came to Mark's that we had found his little stash or cave of illegally clicked pictures. The creepy part came a few months later when Mark sent me another email saying that he went to the estate auction and one of the items for sale was a rope ladder with a back. Yes, it was our rope ladder and our back. This was the creepiest story of what I found in the woods. It still grosses me out and sends chills down my spine when I recollect my first memory of entering that room. When I was a little kid, my parents dropped me off at a local indoor pool. This pool was at the far end of our small town. The plan was to spend the entire afternoon there. However, for some reason, I ended up leaving relatively earlier than expected, and so I decided to go for a walk in the surrounding areas instead. There were no woods or anything around. It was just huge empty expanses of the classic Canadian nowhere. I ended up coming across 2 people lying in the grass. I didn't exactly come in their view as I was significantly far. I could see a large woman and a very overweight man, both in their early 20s. The man was lying on top and they were facing away from me, and my adolescent brain presumed that they must be making out. I stayed a good distance away because I was worried they'd see me, and also because the man on top was moving around quite a bit. And I wasn't really sure I wanted to see unattractive people making out, if indeed that was what they were leading up to. It did look an awful lot like the very slow makeout session to my young mind, except that as an adult, I realized that the angle wasn't right for this to occur while they both still had pants on. So I'd leave for a bit and come back every 15 minutes or so, wondering if they'd have gone or if I'd get to see something. Each time it was the same, where the overweight man was squirming around on top of this woman, her legs together and her lying still. In fact, it took a while before I realized how unnaturally still she was. She didn't move at all, hands at her sides limply while his face moved around her face and neck. I was deeply unnerved by the possibilities. I kept coming back and checking, pacing in panicked circles around the walking paths in the area, and trying to come back from different angles to get a different view. But it was highly difficult because it was the open plains. No longer did my adolescent curiosity expect them to shed their clothing in an isolated field, rather I just wanted some assurance that she was okay. I never got that assurance, lost track of time, and went back to the pool, where I was screamed at and grounded for making them wait a long time. They refused to listen to anything I had to say. They didn't even believe me. But I know what I saw. And it's a strange mental picture to this day.